We are going pretty well for time, so we'll kick along now to our next speaker, Patrick Morgan. Patrick is an author and academic. He taught English at Monash University from 1969 to 1999 and was a Fellow of the State Library of Victoria from 2000 to 2004. He's a former council member of the National Archives, the Australian Council and the Royal Historical Society of Victoria. Patrick is an author and editor of 11 books, including Regional History, The Settling of Gippsland, and editor of 2 volumes and writings, BA Santa Maria. He's a regular publisher in the Quadrant and other journals. Now, Patrick is going to be speaking on a remembrance of the writings of Ray Evans, 1939 to 2013, a former president of the Society. Please welcome Patrick.
Thank you. Could you tell me when 15 minutes are up, if that's all right?
Yes.
So I'll know how we're going. You'll see from my CV, I'm not the only person in the room who's not particularly, I agree with what you're doing, not in the same field as you. I would like, as the last speaker, am I the last speaker today? Second last. Well, I won't go on then. I knew Ray Evans for 50 years from the early 1960s, perhaps before many of you did. From the time I first knew Ray then, he was fully formed with the personality you knew. He was energetic, a self-starter, full of new ideas, but always brushing off objections with a characteristic waving of the arm to any of his new schemes. If he put up an idea to you, which he was bubbling with, he didn't want you to second guess it, to disagree with it. He wanted to enlist you as a helper in his new scheme to carry it out. Over his career there were 3 Rays: political Ray, 1960s and 70s, then economic Ray from 1980 onwards, but political Ray, of course, never disappeared, and underpinning both these periods was religious Ray, never as upfront, never as clearly verbalised, but just as important as the other two. In the 1960s, Ray was an ALP Democratic Socialist on the right wing of the Labor Party, part of a group of people consumed by ideas and politics. I got to the university in the 1960s. They were 5 years before me. They'd completed their degrees, but they hung around Melbourne University in Carlton. Ray lived in Carlton, pursuing their interests. It was a group of upwardly socially mobile and upwardly intellectually mobile Catholic, Jewish and state school products who were taking on the WASP establishment, not by joining it, as the aspiring doctors and lawyers did, but by challenging its values. Ray always retained something of this attitude. He could be scathing about the Liberals, even when working for Western Mining. Ray's main drive at the time was to get an federal ALP government elected. They'd been out of office for about 18 years at this stage. To do this, you had to get rid of the Victorian Socialist Left executive run by Baghdad Bill Hartley and the Socialist Left and the pro-communist left. To this end, Ray, a graduate engineer employed by the SEC at this stage, got himself elected as a delegate to the Fuel and Fodder Workers Union. The Fuel and Fodder Workers Union was an absolutely tiny union because, in the 1960s, people weren't going around the streets of Melbourne tossing around briquettes and hay. Of course, Ray he claimed that as a member of the SEC, he was working with coal. Well, he wasn't actually handling coal. But he did this to get into the annual Trades Hall and ALP conferences, a typical Ray lurk of using political structures to his own advantage. Similarly, though no longer a student, Ray got himself elected as the president of the Melbourne University ALP Club, working with the New South Wales Right to get Whitlam elected. Ray's first big campaign was the Captain Benson affair, if you remember it. Benson was the federal Labor member for Batman, and he was kicked out of the party by Bill Hartley because he was a member of the Defend Australia Committee, a Santa Maria front. Ray sprang into action, characteristically. He formed a new party, the Independent Labor Party. He littered the Batman electorate with blue and white flags and pamphlets. He arranged publicity in the press, and against all predictions, Benson held the seat as an independent, a lost caucus vote for Jim Cairns, who was challenging Whitlam for leadership. This was the first of Ray's many organisations and the first of his many successes. Ray at this stage was influenced by Santa and Franta, Bob Santamaria and Dr. Frank Nerfelmacher, with the proviso that Ray was such an original political strategist and thinker that he would have come to these realisations anyway, but these two mentors happened to tell him these things. Santamaria got across to Ray that in public life, the individual is very ineffective. You need to form an organisation to carry out, like your one here of course, to carry out your aim, because this gives you public credibility. Ray, over his career, formed about 8 or 9 organisations I've counted, including your one. About half the number that his mentor, Bob Santamaria, formed, about 16. Recently I came across on the internet some person who thought he was smart and had just discovered that a whole lot of anti-left organisations had the same mailbox number at the Newport Post Office. Well, we could have told him that long ago. Franta taught Ray how to use shock tactics and how to use the preemptive strike. For example, Ray called his bête noire, Henry Bourne's Higgins, a nutter. Now, actually, Higgins was not a nutter. He was a Methodist himself like Ray, and he's got a very interesting background I haven't got time to go into. But Ray did this to shock us out of our revering Higgins as an Australian icon, the shock tactic which he often used. Franta also taught Ray not to see things in conventional right and left terms, and that's very important in Ray's career, which I might mention later. Like Santa and Franta, Ray was both a thinker and an activist. It was the combination of the two, the thinker and the activist, which was the important part. As the 1960s moved into the 1970s, Ray's group, which I was at that stage a part of, felt politically disenfranchised. The ALP, most people gave up as hopeless. The Liberals, this group thought, lived in the past and didn't understand. And the DLP merely provided for some a way station where they parked their vote for a while. Ray actually stood as a DLP candidate in the 1970s in the Bellarine Peninsula, which I only found out recently. George Orwell said of the writer Jonathan Swift that Swift, this is a quote, was driven into a sort of perverse Toryism by the follies of the Progressive Party of the moment. And that, of course, happened to Ray. I don't say he's a perverse Tory. He may be described perhaps as a radical Tory, but that was his political trajectory. Now we come to economic Ray. A stint at the SEC in Latrobe Valley showed Ray how employers and workers could cooperate as a closed shop, pissing in each other's pockets, if you don't mind the phrase, to their mutual benefit and to the public's financial loss. Gerard Henderson, who mixed in the same circles as Ray in this period in the 70s, wrote his pioneering expose of the Industrial Relations Club at the time, and Ray was also moving into small government, free trade ideas. As we've heard from the last speaker, what's changed? Secondly, Ray's time at the Gordon Institute in Geelong, which morphed into Deakin University, revealed to him people teaching protectionist, big government and other featherbedding notions, a famous favourite word of Ray, featherbedding, which they themselves benefited from, another closed circle. Politics now interested Ray not so much in its own right as it did in the past, but as providing a valuable space which could allow sensible economic policies to operate and flourish. David Kemp gave the best bit of writing on Ray's career at one of your organisation's annual dinners in about 2000 down at the Australia Club. I was there. Was anyone else there at this function? Now, what's important is that we can't find that paper, which was a wonderful paper by Kemp. Can't find it himself, and neither can Des Moore. So if anyone has a copy of that paper, it'd be very important to get in collecting material on Ray. Now, Western mining. I often thought with wonder what Western mining executives from the heart of the business establishment must have thought when Ray, in 1980, with his uncombed hair sticking up and his ill-fitting suit, turned up to preach a new gospel to them, that they needed a political strategy to defeat the unions, the anti-business leftists and the environmentalists who had successfully turned the national conversation against them. I wondered what Hugh Morgan must have felt when he had to read out Ray's speeches on obscure medieval heresies. I always just thought this was funny. Amazingly, Ray had convinced his bosses that a thorough knowledge of these heresies was necessary to save the Australian mining industry. Now, Ray devised a particular strategy, and that was to get Hugh Morgan to give a series of outlandish and extreme speeches. The writing of these speeches came very easily to Ray. He went to extreme and outlandish notions very easily, and these speeches attracted public attention. For a year or so, Morgan was the laughing stock among the trendies in our country, but Ray's strategy was quickly successful because from that time on, when any important industrial issue or economic issue or even geopolitical issue came up, the media now had to invite Hugh Morgan to give the other side from people like Bob Hawke, who were getting a wonderful run on television up to that stage. Ray had many achievements in his life, but this, I think, was his greatest one. And Ray went further. He set up a little private think tank. The other mining companies, Rio Tinto was involved in this, were very impressed with what was Ray's doing, and they sent their PR men along. And Ray invited me to these meetings because I was interested in the social issues they discussed. And Ray said to their PR, they had little PR outfits which were, at that stage, involved in selling their product in their brand. And Ray said, no, the PR must go much further. You must get involved in all the political and strategic and other issues, otherwise you'll be run over. One guy at these meetings pointed out, this is now in the 80s, that every electorate around Australia with a university in it was moving to Labor. Well, that might be obvious now, but it wasn't then. He also pointed out along the Maroondah Highway and the Princes Highway, the Liberal seats along these highways were also moving to Labor because of their higher educational profiles. You could see this immense change occurring in Australian society, and this is where Ray didn't think in right or left terms, he thought in quite new terms. Higher education in the upper middle class used to be the province of the Liberals, correlated with the Liberals, but not now. Today, lazy journalists still think in left-right terms. So a lazy journalist today will get up and refer to the leafy suburbs. The leafy suburbs is a code for sneering at the rich and allegedly complacent old establishment. But actually today, the leafy suburbs are full of people who've got a Monash degree, who've worked all their life in the public service or some quango, and at 50 have been rewarded with a $300,000 job on the Fair Work or other commissions, as you're well aware. Think Michael Lawler. This was the new class, which became Ray's permanent bête noire. The trendy progressives, rather than the old left, the Bill Hartleys, which he was once fighting. Ray understood there were now two establishments, not left or right at all, the traditional one and the new class elites, with the latter becoming, we're all aware of this now, but Ray got onto this very early in the early 80s, and the new class elites, with the latter now becoming more powerful, but playing the trick of pretending they were still the underdogs. They still do this today. Ray's uniqueness was he analysed the tricks of the new class in economic as well as political terms. The real problem was, and I think still is, the emerging new class, And Ray said the traditional left and right had to combine to oppose this new monster. Religious Ray. Ray read a lot, not just politics and economics, but history. Excuse me. I've been working on my farm and I've got hay fever. Ray saw in the great tectonic changes in European history lessons for today. I've only time for one example. Ray loved Norman Cohn's book, The Pursuit of the Millennium. 5 minutes I've got? I'll leave some out. I'll go on to this one though. It's about the year 1000, which is a millennium, and people thought in the year 1000 there might be the apocalypse and the world fall apart. And Cohn wrote this book about crazy medieval politico-religious sects who thought they were charged with bringing history to a triumphant conclusion or Gotterdammerung. Cohn wrote, and when I'm reading this about medieval life, you think of modern day climate changes and catastrophists. This group, Cohn said, was a group of a peculiar kind, this is a quote, a true prototype of a modern totalitarian party, a restlessly dynamic and utterly ruthless group which, obsessed by apocalyptic fantasy and filled with the conviction of its own infallibility, set itself above the rest of humanity and recognised no claim other than its own supposed mission. And in our own day, when the year 2000 came, we had the millennium bug. People claimed that planes were going to fall out of the sky and all the computers were going to stop, and big business was panicked into spending millions on a problem that didn't eventuate or even exist. We know Ray was a committed Christian believer. His personal journey moved from Methodism through Anglicanism, High Anglicanism, almost to Anglo-Catholicism. But in another sense, Ray never moved. The fundamentalist, revivalist preacher in Ray was never far from below the surface. He retained in his personality an apocalyptic cast of mind, an evangelical drive to save those who'd strayed into the slough of despond of protectionist and other self-validating prophecies. Ray often pointed out the people he most disliked, Henry Bourne Higgins, Manning Clark, John Burton, Professor Mark Ball and others, had fathers who were Protestant clergymen. The sons had secularised the messianic and missionary drives of their fathers and channelled them into politics. As a Catholic, I don't have this problem because none of our fathers, as far as we know, were clergymen. Orthodox Freudians would immediately say that Ray had using their rather dubious notion of projection, that Ray had projected onto the world deep unconscious drives which he couldn't bear to recognise himself. But something quite opposite was happening in Ray. Because he'd experienced and understood these heliastic drives in his own religious formation, he saw how dangerous they were when invested in mundane pursuits like communism. The kingdom of heaven cannot be achieved on earth through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Because Ray knew the mote in his own eye, he knew how to cast it out of others. I'm going to leave out a section. What will I end on? I'll end on one anecdote because I can't go ahead a little bit there. I'll just tell you one anecdote about Ray. The day he died, I write for Quadrant, I was rung by the editor of Quadrant. In 24 hours he wanted an article on Ray and I sent it off. He rang me next day and he said, of all the points you made in that article, there's one that I really twigged to because that was my impression of Ray, that Ray, if you worked with Ray, he always thought you were a wimp and didn't go for the full, that you may have had this experience. He was unsatisfied and unsatisfiable. And he said, I only knew Ray in the last 15 years of his life, but about 10 years ago he said he and I were talking against multiculturalism to a huge audience in Sydney who, of course, were against us. And the editor, Keith Winshuttle, said, I got up and said, migrants can talk about their own culture, but they must give their main priority to the country they're in, mainstream Australia, and support that. Otherwise, they'll get into enclaves where they might be against and end up hating their country, etc. Because he thought that was a good argument. Ray got up and said, the multicultural department in Australia has to be banned tomorrow. All grants to multicultural organisations have to go. Dual passports, this is 10 years ago, it's happening now, have to be banned. All pensions that go to Australia and overseas have to be finished. And the Prime Minister has to be instructed. When you saw Ray talking to ministers, Ray told them what to do. He had no deference to ministers. The Prime Minister is to be instructed to say, Australia is not a multicultural society. It's the most monochrome society on earth. It's got the same language, political system, legal system, heritage. That's not the point of the anecdote. When they got off the platform, Ray looked at Keith Windschuttle, who thought he'd performed quite well, with a kind of, as Keith said, mild dismay, even contempt. And he said to Windschuttle, "You were trying to argue with these people. We were not here to talk to them. We were here to drive them out of existence." That was the attitude Ray had to people. I'll just finish up by saying Ray had a unique combination of talents. We saw Ray operating over a wide range of interests, but there really weren't three Rays. It was part of his genius that he was able to seamlessly combine his political, economic and religious drives and to hold them in his own mind and personality as one. For that reason, he was a one-off. Thank you.
Any quick questions, Patrick? No?
Just one, if I can get this right. I understand that a transition point in Ray's life was when he was on a plane going up to Sydney and he was sitting alongside R.V. Parbo, who was the chairman of Western Mining.
Yes.
And at that stage, Ray was Professor of Engineering at Deakin, or something like that.
Yes.
And he said Ray started talking politics and so on to Parbo, and he said something like, and of course you guys in business, you're not interested in this sort of thing anyway. Parvo said to him, "Why don't you go and have a talk to Hugh Morgan?"
Yeah.
And that's how he ultimately made that connection with, who was chairman of Western Mining at that time. So
Look, that's true. Ray used to ask me along to social functions in the boardroom of Western Mining after some of these meetings, and there'd be 10 or 15 people just having a drink after work. And although people talk a lot about Hugh Morgan, Hugh and Ray work, they always mention Hugh Morgan, not running him down at all. R.V. Parvo was terribly impressive because he was a Baltic person, Latvian Resta, who'd been through the ringer, and he knew everything political, and he was very smart. And I noticed Ray had been working for him for 10 years at this stage. He admired Ray a lot, and I think R.V. and Ray were just as important in this combination as Hugh Morgan, because R.V. Parvo was an extremely astute person who had his ears to the political ground probably much more than Morgan did. Yes?
I had a very limited, minimal contact with R.V. Parvo, and I must say that I was stunned and fantastically impressed how attuned he was to the realities.
Yes. Of course, the proviso in all this is Ray's personality was such that Ray came to all these things by working it out himself. He didn't become a free trader because he read Friedman or Adam Smith, and he read them then and later. Ray actually worked from first print of just getting a problem and working on it and working out the answers. It wasn't his reading, it wasn't his mentors, it was just himself who was the main thing in his life, I think.
Thank you, Patrick.
Good.